Hello and welcome to the Instructor's Corner. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 from our textbook, A Survey of Metaphysics by E.J. Lowe. In particular, we're going to be looking at a very famous problem, the ship of Theseus, which has to do with identity for composite objects, specifically through change. How does change affect the identity of composite objects? Just to make sure we're clear about exactly what we're talking about, um, we're considering composite objects. A composite object is just an object that's made up of parts. Um, Many of the everyday objects we think of would fit into this category. Um, a laptop that you might be using is a composite object, right? There's an object, the laptop, but we could break it down into the screen and the battery and the keyboard and um, the RAM and all of those different parts of the laptop. So all of those parts together make a composite object. We'll call it the laptop. And then what we're going to look at in this chapter, and really the strategy that E.J. Lowe uses throughout this textbook, is that we're going to ask metaphysical questions. Um, but what we're going to do is we're going to think about sort of common sense answers to those questions, and we're going to think about whether or not those common sense answers are sustainable. Can we be consistent? Uh, can we avoid contradiction and absurdity when we defend our sort of common sense answers to metaphysical questions? And what we'll see is that what are very simple metaphysical questions um, and what often have very straightforward common sense answers, it can be difficult when we think about problem cases or sort of certain kinds of thought experiments like the ship of Theseus case. It can be difficult to sort of figure out whether or not our common sense answer holds up to scrutiny, or whether or not we need to change sort of our common sense perspective. So here's a claim that we might say, a common sense claim. This is what Lowe says that we want to say. Here's one and the same thing can change its parts over time. So an object can be the same object over time, even if it changes some of its parts. So, for example, E.J. Lowe talks about biological organisms as an example of something that might change its parts over time, right? You constantly have cells that are dying and new cells that are being created, yet it seems like you still exist through all of those changes, right? You, the biological object, composite object. E.J. Lowe talks about a watch. We could also talk about a laptop. When you take your laptop, to a service shop for, say, a battery replacement or something like that, there's a sort of the common sense sort of way to interpret what's going on when your laptop has a new battery installed into it. The common sense view is that you brought your laptop to the shop. The service technician changed one of the parts and then gave you back your laptop, right? It's still your laptop. It's the same composite object it was before. It just has a new part. A part has been replaced. It does seem like it would be absurd if you went back to the shop after they replaced the battery in your laptop and you said, "Can I pick up my laptop?" It would be a little absurd if the technician were to say, "Oh, your laptop doesn't exist anymore. Your laptop was destroyed. But I have this new laptop that I created, and you can purchase that from us if you'd like." Right? That would be you'd say, "No, this is my laptop. All you did was you changed one of the parts, but it's still my laptop." That seems to be kind of the common sense view, right? Is that it can still be the same composite object, even though something has changed, one of its parts has changed. And so to clarify, clearly it's not 100% identical to the laptop you brought into the service shop, right? Something has changed, clearly. That's obviously the case, right? It has a different battery than it had when you brought it into the shop. But we still want to say it's your laptop. It's the same sort of object that's changed. Just like we want to say, even though you have some new cells today that you didn't have, a few years ago in your body, We still want to say it's you, though. Like it's still your body, maybe even though some of the parts have changed. So that's the common sense view. One and the same thing, your laptop, your body, can change their parts over time, the battery or the cells, and still be the same thing, right, that it was before. So the guiding question of this chapter is just going to be, can we say this consistently without falling into absurdity or contradiction? So one thing philosophers hate is views that lead to contradictions, right? We don't want contradictions. We don't want absurd views. We want to see if we can preserve the common sense view that objects can change their parts over time and still be the same objects. What we get, of course, is this case, the ship of Theseus. And the case of the ship of Theseus goes like this. And here I'll read directly from page 25 of our textbook. According to legend, when the hero Theseus died, his famous ship was preserved in the harbor at Athens for many years. In the course of time, parts of it began to decay, and these were replaced by new parts of the same form and materials as the original. Eventually, none of the original parts remained, posing the question of whether the ship in the harbor was still the same ship as the ship that Theseus had sailed in. That is, whether it was numerically identical with the original ship of Theseus. The idea here, once we read this case, is that this is a thought experiment that's supposed to put some pressure on the common sense view that an object can change its parts over time. And the way that this first pass of the thought experiment puts pressure on that is like this. Suppose you had a ship and you were to change one small part of the ship. Maybe one of the sails is torn, and so you put a new sail on. Or maybe one of the masts of the ship was destroyed in battle, and so you put a new mast on the ship. Or one of the planks on the deck was damaged, and so you put a new plank down. In all of those cases, it would be strange to say that you replaced the sail or the mast or the plank, and then all of a sudden you've created a new ship, right? It seems like it's the same ship that it was. It just has a new part. So this is just like we said earlier. This is what we want to say. Your body can gain new cells and lose old cells and still be your body. Your laptop can lose its old battery and gain a new battery and still be your laptop. Well, now the ship of Theseus can lose a sail and get a new sail and still be the ship of Theseus, the very same object, composite object that it was before, even though one of its parts has changed. That's the common sense view. But this thought experiment puts a little pressure on that right away by now making us consider something that's lost every single part. Every part of the ship of Theseus has been replaced by a new part. So now we're thinking, if you were to take the original ship of Theseus and now the sort of renovated ship of Theseus, it's been sort of all the parts have been replaced, they have absolutely no parts in common. There's no physical overlap between them. No part of the original ship remains. Every part that's on the current ship is new in that sense. And so now we're supposed to be thinking about, okay, well, if I can change some parts and still have the same composite object, can I also change every part and still have the same composite object? Or is there some sense in which this is a new ship? Well, there's different options we can take here as we consider the answer to that question. This slide gives us a quick overview of what are the three sort of options when we try to answer questions about sort of how many parts of an object should we allow to change before we think that we have a new object in place. One possibility is you could say, listen, as long as you're changing the parts gradually, slowly over time, change a plank here, change a sail here, change a mast here, and you do this sort of gradual process, it doesn't matter how many parts you change. You can change every single part in the ship. You still have the same ship at the end of the day. That's one view you can take. So even though you've changed every single part, we because it happened gradually, slowly over time, you still have the same composite object you had at the beginning. So now suppose you keep bringing your laptop back to the shop, and they change the motherboard, they change the screen, they change the keyboard, they change the RAM, they change, you know, all of the parts of the laptop. Every time you take it back, they change another part out. Eventually, you have no parts in common with the original laptop, but it's still your laptop. That's the first view you can take here. Lowe thinks that's the intuitive. He calls it, in fact, calls it the obvious answer to the question, right? Because it seems to preserve that common sense intuition that, listen, you can change parts over time and still have the same object. Another solution you could have, so call this like the opposite extreme sort of answer you could have to this question. Is it the same object? How many parts of an object can change in order for it to still be the same object? The other sort of extreme answer is you can't change any of the parts. Call this the 0% view. If anything changes, then you no longer have the same object. And that answer is simple and straightforward. If you're thinking about the ship of Theseus case and you're thinking, man, it's a little strange that every single part has been replaced and we're still calling it the same object. It seems like maybe it should be a new object at this point. Well, if you have that kind of intuition when you hear the ship of Theseus case, then this view explains that. Well, once something changes, it's not the same thing anymore. It's different. That's the 0% view. Lowe resists this view because Lowe wants to say this fails to preserve the common sense view, right? Because on the 0% view, now you have the ship of Theseus and you change one part, right? The sail is torn, so you have a new sail installed on the ship. Now all of a sudden the 0% view says you have a new ship. This is a different ship than the ship that had the old torn sail. You sort of brought into existence a new ship. And that seems kind of strange, right? We don't normally talk about a ship that way. We say it's the same ship with a new sail. It's still the ship of Theseus, right? So this 0% view is simple and straightforward, but seems to fail to preserve that kind of common sense view about change. And then the middle ground view is going to bring in some different terminology here when we talk about transitivity of identity. The middle ground view is going to be, okay, so you've got, on the one extreme, you can change 100% of the parts and still have the same ship. On the other extreme, you have the 0%, you can't change anything, or else you have a different ship. Then you can imagine middle ground views. At some point in the middle, so let's put a limit. So we don't want to say you can change all the parts, or if you don't want to say you can't change any of the parts, you want to say well, you can change some of the parts and still have the same ship. You can't change all of them, but you can change some of them and have the same part, the same ship. This introduces a problem that comes from the transitivity of identity. And so suppose you place a limit on the number of parts that you can change. Lowe talks about, he's just saying, suppose you could change 5% of the parts of the ship and it would still be the same ship. But if you change any more than that, then all of a sudden you've got a different ship. That would be one of these kinds of middle ground views. And it doesn't have to be 5%. That's just a number. Any number between 0 and 100 would be a middle ground view in this sense, right? So set that limit wherever you want. One problem Lowe sees for this view is that it's going to be hard to defend any particular proportion of parts without it just sort of being arbitrary. So why is it 5% of the parts that can change instead of 6% or 4% or 38% or 92%? Like, how do you draw? Do you have a principled reason for drawing the line at the certain percentage that you do? It'd be really difficult to say, to draw a line in a principled way. So that's one sort of issue for this kind of some middle ground view. But another problem is this. Identity is a transitive relation. And so a transitive relation is a relation that if A is related to B in a certain way, and B is related to C in a certain way, then A is related to C in that same way. That's transitivity. So an example of this is the taller than relationship. If Adam is taller than Brian, and Brian is taller than Charlie, then Adam is taller than Charlie. Right? A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. An example of a relationship that would be intransitive, so it's not a transitive relationship, or relation, is the father of relation. So now suppose if Adam is the father of Brian and Brian is the father of Charlie, it turns out it's not the case that Adam is the father of Charlie, right? Adam would be the grandfather of Charlie in this case, not the father, right? So that's not a transitive relation. Turns out identity is a transitive relation. So if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. Okay, so that's the transitivity of identity. That's kind of important terminology to know. What in the world does that have to do with this middle ground view that where you can change some of the parts of a ship but not all of them? Well, suppose you set the limit that up to 5% of the parts of a ship can be changed, and it'll still be the same ship. Well, now suppose you have the original ship of Theseus with all its original parts, and let's say you change 4% of those parts. So now we've got, in this relationship between A, B, and C that we're thinking about here, A is the original, fully original ship of Theseus, all the original parts. B is the ship of Theseus with 4% of its parts changed. Well, according to this middle ground view, we can change up to 5% of the parts and still have the same ship, right? Okay, so if that's the case, then A is identical to B. A and B are the same ship because they're only 4% apart, right? But now suppose you have B, which is the 4% ship. It's the original ship of Theseus with 4% of its parts changed. And let's suppose you change 4% of its parts again, 4% more of its parts. Well, now you've got C, right, which is, it's gone through 2 iterations of this 4% of change, right? But B and C are only 4% apart from each other, right? B had 4% of the original parts changed. C now has 8% of the original parts changed. B and C are only 4% apart from each other. So, by this rule, this 5% rule, B is identical to C. The problem that arises here is if identity is transitive, then we said the original ship of Theseus, A, is identical to 4% ship of Theseus, B. We also said 4% ship of Theseus, B, is identical to 8% ship of Theseus, C. So what does that mean? Well, if identity is transitive, then if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. So original ship of Theseus is identical to 8% changed ship of Theseus, C. But that violates our rule. Remember, we said only 5% could change in order for it to be the same object. But because of this feature of the identity relation, namely that it's transitive, it turns out that what you get is a ship that's been changed in 8% of its parts is not identical to the original ship. And because of the transitivity of identity, you get the claim that the 8% ship is identical to the original ship of Theseus. And so you get a contradiction. And so that middle view turns into a contradiction. And Lowe suggests that the only way to be consistent with that kind of view is to reduce it to a 0% view. And turns out any sort of middle ground percentage of parts that you allow to change is going to lead to this transitivity problem. And so the only way to be consistent is to have a 0% view or a 100% view, because without falling prey to this problem from the transitivity of identity. And so since we've got 2 logically consistent views, the 0% view and the 100% view, but one of the views preserves common sense and one of them fails to preserve common sense, we should prefer the view that preserves common sense, namely the 100% view. So the new ship of the renovated ship of Theseus that has all of its parts replaced is still the same ship. It is the ship of Theseus. So, in case you were worried that we came to an easy and quick solution to a philosophical problem, now we get the Ship of Theseus Part 2. And this part of the problem is where Lowe says it really gets interesting. And so here, reading again from our textbook, suppose that as the original parts of Theseus's ship are gradually replaced by new ones, those original parts are carefully removed to a warehouse and stored there, until the warehouse eventually contains all of the original parts, while all the replacement parts belong to the ship in the harbor, the renovated ship, as we have decided to call it. And then suppose that someone puts all of the original parts together again to form a ship which is exactly like the original ship of Theseus. Call this ship the reconstructed ship. Now we have two very similar ships, the renovated ship and the reconstructed ship, each of which might seem to have some claim to be identical with the original ship of Theseus. And so now we're left with, as we view the renovated ship and the reconstructed ship, we're left with this question: which is the ship of Theseus? Let's consider some of the answers we could give to this question. Seems like we can say a few things. One response we could give is that only the renovated ship is the ship of Theseus. And so remember on the original, the part one of the ship of Theseus problem, where no other ship was being constructed. You just had parts being replaced on the original ship of Theseus, and they were taken away, maybe destroyed or whatever. But all you had was really the renovated ship on the harbor, right? And so eventually it had none of the same parts in common, but according to the 100% view, you can change the parts gradually over time. Even if you change all of the parts, you still have the very same ship, the ship of Theseus. And so for all of those reasons, you might say, well, listen, in that case, when no one was rebuilding another ship over in the warehouse, this was still the identical to the ship of Theseus. Well, that hasn't changed. The same process has happened here. You've just renovated the ship. So clearly, the renovated ship is the ship of Theseus. Another option you could take is only the reconstructed ship is the ship of Theseus. And according to this view, or in the support of this view, I should say, you can think, well, the reason why I would think the reconstructed ship, that is the ship over in the warehouse, is the ship of Theseus, is because it has exactly all of the original parts of the ship arranged exactly as they were originally. So whenever that day was when the ship of Theseus was first put together and set sail, all of the parts of that ship are now reconstructed in the warehouse, in the reconstructed ship. So clearly, this is the real ship of Theseus. Something else that's in favor of the reconstructed ship being the ship of Theseus is, now imagine there was no renovated ship out on the harbor. But suppose the original ship of Theseus had been on the harbor, and you had just taken it apart, taken all the pieces apart, transported them to the warehouse, and put them back together. It seems like you have the same object, right? Even though you've taken it apart and put it back together, it seems like you have the same object. It seems like this sort of thing happens all the time. 15 years ago, my wife and I bought a dining room table when we first moved in together after our wedding. And it's composed of parts. In particular, it's got the tabletop, the eating surface, and it's got 4 legs. Well, it turns out over the last 15 years, I have many times taken the table apart in order to move it, maybe to a new house, or through a doorway to another room because we're rearranging the furniture or something like that. And then I reassembled it. I take the legs off, move it to a different place, put it back together. My suggestion to you is that we still own the very same table that we purchased 15 years ago after we were married. Just because I take it apart and move it and put it back together, it's still the same composite object. It's still the same table. That seems to be the sort of common sense view here. So now with the reconstructed ship, all the original parts of the ship of Theseus were taken apart, they were moved and stored, and then at some later point put back together. So it seems like the reconstructed ship is the ship of Theseus. What's interesting about these first two answers, only the renovated ship is the ship of Theseus, and only the reconstructed ship is the ship of Theseus, is that if the reconstructed ship in the warehouse didn't exist, if nobody had put the parts back together, then we would, according to the common sense view, we'd look at the renovated ship on the harbor and say, this is obviously the ship of Theseus. It would be more or less uncontroversial that that was the ship of Theseus. Flip this around, though. Suppose we had just taken the original ship apart and moved it to the warehouse and put it back together. So the reconstructed ship in the warehouse exists, but there was no renovated ship. We had done no renovating process. We had just taken the ship apart, moved it, and put it back together. If that had happened, then the reconstructed ship would obviously, uncontroversially, be the ship of Theseus, right? However, when both things happen together, you have a renovated ship and a reconstructed ship, then all of a sudden you've got a real question about which one has the best claim to be the ship of Theseus. And so this leads us to the possibility of a third answer to the question. Which one is the ship of Theseus? Well, we just said both of them have a great claim to being the ship of Theseus, so why not say both ships are identical to the ship of Theseus? And this is going to give us a problem, and it's going to be a problem that relates back to this idea that identity is transitive. So as you can still see on the screen here, this transitivity of identity is going to be important. If the reconstructed ship and the renovated ship are both the ship of Theseus, then you get a transitivity problem again. And that is this. If the reconstructed ship is identical to the original ship, and the original ship is identical to the renovated ship, then the reconstructed ship is identical to the renovated ship. So if A, or another way to put it, if A, the renovated ship, is identical to B, the original ship, and B, the original ship, is identical to C, the reconstructed ship in the warehouse, then A, the renovated ship on the harbor, is identical to C, the reconstructed ship in the warehouse. But you should see a problem here, right? Clearly the ship on the harbor is not identical to the ship in the warehouse. Here's one important difference. They're located at two completely different locations. So you get this sort of contradiction that comes with the both ships are the ship of Theseus. So they both got good claims to being the ship of Theseus, but it sure doesn't seem like both of them can be the ship of Theseus. So how do you decide between them? Another option might be, again, don't make a decision between them. If both ships can't be the ship of Theseus, you can't figure out which one is the ship of Theseus, then maybe neither ship is the ship of Theseus. That would be a possibility as well. Since we have no principled way to distinguish which one is the ship of Theseus while excluding the other, why not just say neither of them is? However, we know that common sense says that both ships have good claims to being the ship of Theseus. So this seems to be a less than desirable option as well, right? Because in order to say that neither ship is the ship of Theseus, you have to say that the good claim that the renovated ship has to being the ship of Theseus is bad, and the good claim that the reconstructed ship has to being the ship of Theseus is bad. You're rejecting those claims that we thought were good claims. So it's difficult to identify any of these answers that's really appealing and really preserves all of our sort of common sense intuitions about identity of composite objects through change. One possibility is, one response to this is you could say maybe something's wrong with common sense. Maybe what we found is that this ship of Theseus case has put pressure on our common sense view about the identity of composite objects over time. And it's shown us that that common sense view we have is wrong. And maybe a lot of times we find out through studying the world and trying to figure out how things work, we learn that the kind of common sense views we had about things before we did our research turned out to be false. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But Lowe is going to offer his own solution to this problem, and it's based on a principle that we can call Lowe's appropriation principle. And the appropriation principle goes like this. Once the original parts of a composite object, say a ship, have been appropriated by another distinct composite object, another ship, they cease to be parts of that original ship. And even if those parts are later reassembled to compose another ship, the ship that they then compose is a new ship, numerically different from the original one. So the idea is going to be roughly something like this. When you replace the sail on the original ship of Theseus, the old sail is taken away and a new sail is installed. The new sail is appropriated by the ship, that it becomes one of the parts of the ship of Theseus, and the old sail is no longer a part of the ship. So now what you've got two sails. The new one is now a part of the ship of Theseus. The old one is now no longer a part of any ship at all. It's just an old sail. So as you replace parts over time, you take a plank off. Now the new plank is now appropriated as a part of the ship of Theseus. The old plank is now no longer a part of any ship at all. And you do the same with the mast and the same, all of the parts of the ship. Right? So when you're collecting all these pieces in the warehouse, you're not really collecting parts of the ship of Theseus. You're collecting physical objects, parts that used to be parts of a ship, the ship of Theseus, but now they're no longer parts of anything because new parts have been appropriated into the ship and the old parts are no longer a part of the ship at all. So then, what would you say if you had the ship of Theseus on the harbor and then someone somewhere else had just a collection of ship parts that weren't a part of any ship at all and they put it together and they built a ship from it? Well, you would say they built a new ship, right? There's the ship of Theseus on the harbor, and now you've got to come up with a new name for this other ship because it's a new ship, it's a different ship. Well, Lowe wants to say the same thing happens in the case of the renovated ship and the reconstructed ship. The renovated ship on the harbor, the one that you've been replacing parts on gradually over time, that's the ship of Theseus because of those parts have been appropriated. However, the reconstructed ship, because those parts have been taken away from the ship of Theseus and they're no longer a part of any ship at all, when you put those reconstructed parts back together, even though it turns out that all of the parts are from the original ship of Theseus and they're put together exactly the way they were the day that ship was built, what you're doing is you're building a new ship because you've taken a collection of parts that belong to no ship at all and you've put them together to form a new ship. So you need a new name for that reconstructed ship. It's not the ship of Theseus. That's Lowe's solution to this problem. And it's important to note that this is different from a simple case of disassembly and reassembly. In that case, the parts you take off the original ship are never replaced, and no other parts are ever appropriated into the ship of Theseus. So we're imagining the case where you just have the ship of Theseus on the harbor, you take it apart, move the parts to the warehouse, and put it back together. There's no appropriation that's happening in this case, right? Parts aren't being appropriated at any new ship. This would be just like taking when I take the table apart that my wife and I purchased 15 years ago, and I move it and put it back together. It's not the same as if I had taken a damaged leg off the table and replaced it with a new one. If I had done that, then the table would have appropriated a new part, the new leg, and the old leg would no longer be a part of the table. But when you disassemble and reassemble, there's no appropriation taking place at all. That's why if you weren't reconstructing a new ship, or I should say renovating a new ship, and you were just taking the parts to the warehouse and putting them back together, then you would be moving the ship of Theseus to the warehouse, right? And that reconstructed ship would be the ship of Theseus still, because none of the parts had been appropriated. No new parts had been appropriated. However, if you are appropriating new parts as you're moving the old parts, those old parts no longer are parts of the original ship of Theseus. And so when you put them back together later, you're not reconstructing the ship. You're building a new ship from used parts, so to speak. And so that's it for this week's Instructor's Corner video. We've looked at this ship of Theseus example. Remember that the overall picture here is that we've got this common sense view that a ship can change all of its parts and still be the very same ship. And Lowe's strategy is to try to preserve that common sense view, even in the face of difficult problems like this ship of Theseus thought experiment. If we can preserve common sense views, we should try to do that, according to Lowe. And so Lowe thinks that we can preserve the common sense view if we think about this appropriation principle. It helps us make a principled distinction between basic cases of disassembly and reassembly and this ship of Theseus case where you've got disassembly, reassembly, and renovation going on at the same time. We can come up with a principled difference between the two cases. And it allows Lowe to preserve the 100% view, right? 100% of the parts have changed, but we still have the very same ship of Theseus on the harbor. That doesn't lead to this weird transitivity problem that you get because you end up with two different ships that are both identical to the ship of Theseus. It doesn't lead to that problem because of the appropriation principle.